Probably should have been standing for that song. That's okay. I asked this question to my 8:30 service, whenever we meet. And I didn't get any takers except Tom over here. And that is, are there any contrarians in here? Just raise your hand if you're a contrary person. Janet, are you a little bit? Art? Yeah, I knew Art. Sure, yeah. Nobody, no other takers? Now, I've always thought a contrarian was like that argumentative uncle you have to deal with at Thanksgiving, or that coworker that gets into conspiracy theories and loves to share them, or simply that know-it-all neighbor. You know, people who have a different opinion about things than you do. They're contrary to your opinions. But something I learned this past week, there's a specific definition to the word contrarian, which is a contrarian is an investor who prefers to buy stocks when most people are selling, or vice versa. So they do contrary to what other stockbrokers are doing. And I found that kind of interesting. When I think of a contrarian, I also think of that nursery rhyme, Mary, Mary, quite contrary, which is likely referring to Mary, Queen of Scots, i.e. Bloody Mary. And as we know, she was very quite contrary by all accounts. And I also think of the phrase, contrary to popular belief. When a sentence begins with those words, you know maybe something a little humorous is coming. Like, contrary to popular belief, a barrel full of monkeys isn't fun at all, and is in fact quite horrifying. Now, this word, in my swimming around in my head, I became more aware of the rather contrary statements that we find in our readings today. Beginning in the book of Lamentations, we find this theological perspective that, at least from my point of view, is rather contrary to what most people now believe. So Lamentations, kind of following the book of Deuteronomy, which kind of sets the tone for a lot of this, Lamentations is of the opinion that God actively punishes or causes suffering in response to human sin. Now, in recent years, we've heard this sort of theology from the likes of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, who would blame natural disasters on perceived sinfulness out in our culture. Now, there's a backdrop to Lamentations. There's a setting for it. Much of the Old Testament, the historical setting for Lamentations is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE at the hands of the Babylonians. So Lamentations is a lament, of course, where it gets its name, a passionate expression of grief and sorrow about what is happening in Jerusalem. In fact, the very first verse in the book says this: "How lonely sits the city," that is Jerusalem, "that once was full of people." So the city has been decimated. So you can see why that would create a lot of lamenting. And to explain these tragic events, the writer assumes that God is punishing the nation of Judah for her sins. Listen to verse 5. It says it straightforward. "Her foes," that is the Babylonians, "have become the masters. Her enemies prosper because the Lord has made her," that is Judah, "suffer for the multitude of her transgressions." Now, again, this is contrary to what many Christian people believe today. Not everyone, but it's contrary to what I believe. Many of us no longer assume that God actively causes human suffering in response to human sin. I think it's a largely discredited theological perspective. So whether I'm right or not, I think the writer of Lamentations would find me a little bit contrarian to his or her views. I also found a couple of contrarian statements in our reading from 2 Timothy. In the first chapter, verse 7, the writer claims, "God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. The writer could have said it this way: contrary to popular belief, God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, etc., etc. So it's a contrary statement coming forth from the writer of 2 Timothy. And then later on in verse 9, we find another contrarian statement. God saves us, says the writer, not according to our works, but according to God's own purposes and grace. According to God's grace. This is a great theological statement because it contrasts, notice the relationship between the words contrast and contrarian. It contrasts with the traditional way people have assumed that we are saved. I'm talking about historically speaking. People assume they are saved according to their works, specifically their good works. So just as people have historically assumed that God punishes us for our bad works, people have also assumed that God rewards us for our good works. This is straight out of the book of Deuteronomy, by the way. This is the core theological tenet of the book of Deuteronomy. I call it ledger theology. Any accountants in here? Anybody who works with ledgers? I call this ledger theology. God supposedly has a ledger for each one of us, marking down our good works on one side of the ledger and our bad works on the other side of the ledger, and God sees which one has more marks on it, the good side or the bad side. One of the great insights of the New Testament, especially the letters of Paul, and later on, really the Protestant Reformation put an emphasis on this, is that God's grace is not predicated on how good we are. There is no ledger. And that was one of the great insights of the New Testament and the Reformers. Our religion is full of contrariness. A great example, of course, would be Jesus himself. And we see his rather contrarian nature close up in our reading from Luke 17. And in this short passage, he says two things that are really sort of contrary to what most people believe or have believed. First of all, most people believe that we need a large amount of faith in order to do great things. Even the apostles believed this. They begged Jesus, "Increase our faith," they said to him. Why did they ask? Why did they say that? Why did they request that? Well, they were reacting to Jesus' rather radical teachings about forgiveness. In the previous passage, Jesus said that we need to forgive a person who sins against us every single time they sin against us. Even if someone sins against us 7 times a day. Now, if you turn over to Matthew's version of this same passage, Matthew's Jesus says 70 times, or even more, 70 times 7. Well, you get the idea. No matter which calculation you use, the ones from Matthew or Luke, that is a lot of forgiveness. Most of us are not likely to be so forgiving. I mean, if you have a neighbor who has a dog who keeps doing his business on your lawn, there's only so many times you're going to forgive that, right? And I would suspect if that dog did his business 7 times in one day on your lawn, you're not going to be forgiving. But that's what this passage is about. So the apostles apparently do not believe they have sufficient amounts of faith to forgive people so easily. And so they beg Jesus, increase our faith. We need more of it. Pile it on. Jesus, though, is a contrarian. And he's probably a little frustrated with these guys. And so he says to them, hey, you've already got enough faith. You just need to use it. Use what you have. He famously says, if you had the faith the size of a mustard seed, which is tiny, you could say to this mulberry tree over here, I guess there was one in the vicinity, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Well, we know that's hyperbole, but his point is, contrary to popular belief, we do not have to have a large amount of faith to do great spiritual things like practice unlimited forgiveness. We just need to exercise the faith that we have. The second contrarian thing he says is a little more difficult to understand. I think I have a good grasp of it. But it has to do with slaves that are coming in from the fields after a long, hard day of work. You get the picture. And he notes that if you're a slave owner, right? If you're a slave owner, you're not going to ask your slaves when they come in from the field, been working all day, to sit down and enjoy a nice meal. You're not going to do that if you're a slave owner. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to have them, after they're all tired and sweaty, you're going to have them prepare a meal for you, and then they get to have their meal. And that sounds rather harsh to us, right? But what he's doing, he's not prescribing anything. He's describing what's going on. He was not condoning slavery or the mistreatment of slaves. He's only saying this is the cultural norm. That's what slaves do. Slaves do what they ought to do, which is work all day long. But the application is this. Followers of Jesus should simply do what they ought to do as well, which is work in the fields of God all day long without expecting a reward at the end of the day. We don't work for the reward, he is saying. We work because we're responding to God's love and grace. So as I said earlier, this all ties in together. Contrary to popular belief, God doesn't reward us or punish us based on our works. So this is Jesus sort of giving his theological understanding of how we relate to God. Okay. So again, there are many contrarian things that we could talk about in terms of our faith. But I believe that celebrating World Communion, as we are doing today, might be the most contrarian thing that we do all year long. Let me explain. First of all, World Communion supposes that all people around the world share the same values. Well, we don't. The world lost, as you know, a great peacemaker this past week, Shimon Peres of Israel. It's possible that if we all shared his values, there would be peace in the world. But there isn't. So to break bread and drink wine on World Communion Sunday, as if we are all in this together as one world, really is contrary to reality. World Communion is a symbolic act of an ideal existence on planet Earth, one where all people live together in shalom, which is sort of a Hebrew word for peace, all-encompassing word for peace. When we gather at this table, we are, on World Communion Sunday, we are enacting a reality that is unreality. So that's point number one. Secondly, World Communion assumes an open table, does it not? And an open table is an exception to the rule. It is contrary to the rule in the history of Christianity. It's not the norm. The most common table tradition, historically speaking, is one that is closed to either non-believers and or non-members of that particular church or denomination. So when we gather at an open table, we are flying in the face of Christian tradition. We are being contrarian. And I love that about World Communion and our communion in total. Third, World Communion is contrarian because it asks us to see the table of the other as valid, the table of the other as valid, even those tables that exist in places that seem very foreign to us. So in a symbolic way, World Communion invites us to the table and to the worship space of the other, the other. I think this is especially contrarian in a culture like ours is becoming, that is largely suspicious of the other, that is the foreigner, and is not exactly in a welcoming mood when it comes to the other. Does this ring true to you? Does it seem like we're all that welcoming these days? World Communion Sunday is contrary to what we call xenophobia, which is a fear of the other, which is something that I think sort of dominates our American discourse these days. So world communion is contrarian because we're living in an era that is reacting more and more negatively to the possibility of a world community, a global village, if you will. And again, there are many examples that we could point to. One is the recent example of the refusal of countries to take refugees from other parts of the world simply because of their place of origin, because we're afraid of what they might bring, and so forth. And I think we also saw this in Brexit, which is the British exit from the European Union. Those are a couple of examples of this fear of the other and responding to that in a negative way. Well, my point is, World Communion Sunday is an act of contrariness. And yes, that's a word. I looked it up. Contrariness. It is perhaps the most contrarian thing that we do all year long. It might even feel contrary to the way we feel tomorrow. Tomorrow we might wake up and go, nah, I don't want to have anything to do with the other. And yet I don't think there's anything wrong with observing a day, just once a year, when we can act like a stockbroker who buys when everybody else is selling. Or that opinionated uncle at the Thanksgiving table who doesn't think anything like the rest of us. Or that conspiracy theorist coworker. Or that know-it-all neighbor who, some people are, sometimes truth is like a broken clock. It's right twice a day. And I think the know-it-all neighbor's like that. He's going to be right twice a day. Or even Jesus himself. If we dare to be that contrarian, even Jesus himself, we should aspire to do that at least once a year. So when we come to the communion table today, the one that is pretentiously labeled World Communion, think about how contrarian we really are for doing that. Amen.